Might as well start, Daniel, and
Yeah,
I'll carry on. Alistair, we will see Alistair running away from the fire or to the assembly point. This is operations in action. It's a dynamic subject.
Absolutely. All right, well, I'll get us started while Alistair moves. So, yeah, welcome and thanks for joining us today for the first author webinar series, Changing Perspectives. Today, I'm delighted to be facilitating this conversation with our operations management authorship team on adapting operations management teaching to a changing world. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Daniel Reid. I'm an academic consultant with Pearson UK. Also joining us today are Nigel Slack from Warwick Business School and Alistair Brandon Jones from the University of Bath. Nigel and Alistair, I'll let you introduce yourselves fully when I hand over, but as a brief introduction, both are authors on our market-leading portfolio of operations management titles, and we're really pleased to hear from both of you today. Just to think a quick thanks to my colleagues on the call as well, who are in the background ensuring this webinar runs smoothly. I'll pass over to Nigel and Alistair shortly, but before we get started, I just want to run through some quick housekeeping. So we know many of you are working from home, and as you know from these kind of conversations, we sometimes get background noise, fire alarms as it were. So if you could please make sure you're on mute to ensure everyone can hear our presenters properly. We have a packed agenda and lots to get through today, but first we'd like to thank those of you who pre-submitted questions. We've tried to incorporate these questions into the agenda to make sure they're covered. However, as always, we would like this to be an interactive and engaging session as much as possible. So please feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat or come off mute, and we'll get to as many of them as we can throughout the session as well as at the end. Okay, that's all from me. I'll pass things over now to Nigel, and bear with us while we get the screen set up.
Okay, thanks, Daniel, and welcome and thank you for coming here. I'm sure Alistair will kind of jump in as and when he is able to.
I am. I'm here, so it's all good. I just think you may get a little bit of background noise with the wind, but it's reasonably calm, so I'm all good.
We'll hear dogs barking and birds cheeping and
exactly,
things.
Exactly.
It'll be a nice rural setting. Can I just say before I do start, or we start, that what we're going to give is very much personal views of this idea about what is changing in the world and how that's likely to affect operations management. It's not at all prescriptive. All we're doing is saying this is how we see it. This is why we believe it's important to address this kind of issue. And we're very happy to debate the issues. When you're writing textbooks, and clearly we're looking at it from both teachers and textbook writers' perspective, it's always a bit of a balance between what personally you believe is important in the subject and what you believe is being taught around the world, or what seems to be taught around the world. And we do try and keep in touch with the various markets that we sell books into, from Singapore to Scandinavia. Markets are different to a certain extent, so please accept that. Let me try and share my screen here. And then we will... Okay. That's shared okay, Daniel, is it?
Yep, I can see the screen, no problem.
Great, okay. Look, this is about what we're wanting to do. First of all, is the environment really getting more turbulent? It seems to be, but I do remember being argued against by an economist a few years ago when I started a talk by saying things are getting more competitive, and he proved to me in great detail that actually the world had always been very competitive. So I think it's important to try and establish whether things are getting more turbulent, then trying to identify what is changing, that is what has already changed, and we may not have fully reflected it in our teaching or in our writing, and what is likely to change in the future, and how that will impact the subject that we all teach in operations management, and how should it affect our teaching, particularly which changes should we incorporate? How do we make that decision about what to incorporate, in our case, in the book, and what not to, and how to do it? Do we spread it across through all the chapters or through all the sessions, or do we have a specific lesson devoted to that one topic? Let's deal with the first bit, which is the idea of turbulence and uncertainty. This is the latest figures I can get hold of. In fact, some came out today of all places, which is the economists' look at the idea of uncertainty. And the methodology for this research is slightly odd. They look at various reports from the world economy and count the number of times the word uncertainty or similar words have been used. The data finishes around a year ago, a bit less than a year ago. So you can see that last little blip in uncertainty caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't fully reflected as yet. But even notwithstanding that, you can see the trend is generally for higher degrees of uncertainty. And what intrigues me more are the kind of barriers or the kind of limits around that. Sorry? Okay, didn't hear that, sorry. If you could mute, please, unless you're asking a question, thank you. The volatility around the increase in uncertainty is also increasing. So personally, I am happy to accept the idea that the world is getting less stable in some ways. How we reflect that? Well, you probably do this already. What we are using increasingly is this idea of VUCA, standing for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Volatility being how much things are going to change up and down both ways. Uncertainty being the degree of likelihood of the future, how certain we can be or uncertain we can be about what things can happen in the future. Complexity being the intrinsic nature of the connection between elements or actors within whatever system we're looking at. And ambiguity being the ability to interpret whatever data we're getting. What both Alistair and I believe is important, however, is that we should go beyond just simply using these four dimensions of uncertainty to describe the nature of an environment, but try and reflect how operations are increasingly trying to do something about it, trying to mitigate the effects of these things. So, VUCA is getting particularly important. We started including it about an editorial cycle and a half ago in our books, and it's likely to get more important rather than less important. But before we consider future changes, probably it's best to think about what may have already changed and are we reflecting those changes? I've been in operations and operations teaching a long time, and a lot has happened. And periodically, the author team for our books, we get together and we think, are we really reflecting what's happening in the world with our subject? So, for example, if you go back to the beginning, when I was a practicing operations manager, the subject of operations management, and when I studied it at university a long time ago, operations management was called production management, and it was about physical goods creation, and it was about core operations stroke manufacturing activities, things like scheduling and layout in a factory setting. It's changed a lot. First of all, it's changed, obviously, to include all kinds of offerings, service, physical goods, or some combination of the two. And physical goods is somewhere between 10% and 20% of GDP of most countries, depending on which country you're talking about. It's never, ever in the history of the world ever been the majority of economic activity. It doesn't mean to say it's not important. That's the background I come from. I do think it is important. Nevertheless, perhaps we should wonder whether it still dominates our teaching a little too much. Similarly, operations now I would argue, includes the operations activity of all functions, marketing processes, human resource processes, financial processes are all part of our domain. We have something interesting to say about those processes, even though they're internal, even though they're not within the operations function. You can use operations principle to think about them and improve them. Thirdly, we can think about unit of analysis. Are we working at a process level, relatively micro, an operations level, the factory, the hospital, the hotel, medium level, or are we thinking about whole supply networks and supply chains, increasing unit of analysis? Well, increasingly, that's exactly what we're doing. So if you look at that pink cube there, that's what operations management used to be. If you go well back to when I was educated in it, the blue cube is where we are now. It is a far bigger subject. The scope has expanded dramatically. And should we be reflecting that dramatic expansion? It's not always easy to do so. And it's certainly not traditional to do so, but I would argue that perhaps we should be doing more to try and reflect the blue rather than the pink cube there. What we are doing is constantly trying to do that, and sometimes we're late. Sometimes we're okay, sometimes we're even early, sometimes we're too early. But where we are late, here's an example. For example, the more we have been thinking about it recently, the more I am convinced we have not done our duty by the role of data collection and the role of data analysis within operations. We should have been onto this a lot earlier in our writing. You'll recognize this if you use the books, the idea of input, transformation, output, input resources being transformed resources, and transforming resources. Now, we've always talked about information being a transformed resource, in things like libraries, consultancies, banks, etc., are basically information processing factories of sort. But data is different. Data is what we collect and is to do with the running of the operation. And we collect data in order to try and influence the activities of operations. And as again, you will know, we use this rather alliterative concept of activities being divided into direct, things like strategic issues, design, deliver, and develop. We use that because it's easier for students to remember. And of course, data is collected both internally and externally from customers, from suppliers, and that data is increasingly used to form feedback loops for that transformation process. In effect, the data becomes a transforming resource, whereas information in something like a bank is a transformed resource. That's the thing that you change in order to add value. Data, slightly different concept, is a transforming resource. You use it to run the operation. So we have a model that accepts that data has a value, that accepts that it forms a feedback loop for the running of the operation, and in effect is a transforming resource that feeds into some kind of operations decision making operation or set of processes. And of course, why have we suddenly started thinking in this way and incorporating this into our model? Well, largely because of the role of analytics in doing that. AI and even algorithmic decision making has transformed the power that operations have to use data in a value-added sort of way. And what we're trying to do is reflect that, and that will be coming up in future editions of all our books. But I admit, hand on heart, we were just too late in incorporating that. Sometimes we're more or less right. Alistair, do you want to talk about this?
Yes. So I hope you can hear me okay, Nige?
Yeah, I can.
Yep, great. So, there are other times I think where we essentially get our timing pretty good, and also where we look to adopt a kind of let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And IKEA is a great example of that. IKEA is a case study we've used in several editions, but in quite different ways. So as the early editions of the book spoke to IKEA, it spoke to a kind of key of what is the overall strategy of the big box IKEA idea? What does it look like from a customer perspective? And what are the operational implications of making that strategy work? So it's very much around an operations-led strategy. It was very much around the way in which various aspects of the operation have been designed to suit the strategy. More recently, of course, we've seen IKEA start to struggle with that particular model. We see a market that's evolving, younger people who don't have cars, for example, who don't want to travel out to the big box, those who have less time, those who are less willing to build their own products, for example, those who want advice on design rather than simply to go and collect products, those who are concerned with recycling and sustainability, etc., etc. And so what you've seen from IKEA is essentially a response, not a response that is as a result of a crisis, because still fundamentally, IKEA makes a huge amount of money from its big box operation, and it's very successful still. But essentially a trialing of various other avenues for reaching the market, a kind of move towards an omni-channel model, a move towards meeting potentially different kinds of market needs, be it having small town centre shops, be it moving much more strongly to an online e-commerce environment, be it in terms of some of the take back products and the sort of closed loop sustainability, be it through TaskRabbit and we will make it for you. Now, all of those ideas are essentially pilots, and IKEA have been quite explicit about the fact that they don't expect all of these avenues to work, that they're almost trialing them and then seeing which ones really resonate and seeing how they operationalize them. So as a case study, we kind of have a choice, right? We can either just kill off an IKEA case and say, well, let's just move on to something else, or we can quite radically change the case about what it's fundamentally about. It starts to become much more about the way in which shifting markets challenge an established business model, and then through that challenge the alignment between strategy, operations, decisions, metrics, etc. And so we can still speak to really important ideas and operations around alignment, around what will we do if IKEA are to make a success of this. And so we now run, the case has changed quite dramatically. Nigel rewrote that. But the way we teach it has also changed. It becomes much more often about picking one of those new initiatives and really getting into discussions in the class around, well, what are the operational implications? What are the customer value implications of this? What does it mean to a customer going to IKEA? Do they kind of know what IKEA is all about now, etc.? So there, I think, is an example where we have looked to not simply give up on a really powerful idea or a particular powerful case, but to roll with those changes and make sure that all of our cases, be they end of chapter cases like this one or case boxes, are as up to date as they can be. We've seen something quite similar around some of our COVID cases, where there is a time sensitive nature of those cases, which we wanted to incorporate to an extent, but we also need to understand how they might resonate beyond a COVID world. So thinking about the way in which COVID issues have fundamentally changed thinking around supply chain design is a good case box to include in a textbook, whereas simply talking about a specific instance of a COVID response may date quite quickly.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, that's quite a big change, as Alistair said, really. But not every change is going to be big. So, for example, on something quite mundane like economic order quantity, that of course we cover in the book, because everyone teaches it, and undergraduates tend to like the pseudo optimization that it gives. But what you will find is that the nature of shortage costs and the likelihood of shortage will receive about twice the column inches in the next edition as it does now. So not all changes like the IKEA case, which is a whole session or an end of chapter case in our case, are going to be that big. Sometimes there's lots of little things, like the way we treat some aspect of EOQ there.
Yeah, and
sometimes, sorry, Al. Go.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think, and also just building on that idea, it's also reminding ourselves that, if we're teaching inventory management, it depends on who we're teaching it to as to whether purely a product orientation is going to resonate, or whether we need to make more of the effort to bring in the inventories of data or the inventories of customers, and sort of how we spin a class should be influenced heavily by who is in that class. And that's something I think we really encourage everyone to do. It's to use our book as a sort of starting point, but to remember that you do need to tailor it based on the kind of nature of the class and the interests of that group. Sorry, Nigel.
No, as I was saying, sometimes we're about right, I think, in hindsight of the way we introduce changes. Sometimes we're even too early, like TradeLens, Alistair.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of examples here where effectively Nigel and I, in different ways, jumped the gun. So for Operations and Process Management 6th edition, I was really rather proud of my case box on TradeLens. It linked into some lovely content that Nigel had written about blockchain and the potential transformational effects of blockchain on supply networks, what blockchain does, how it works. And here is a really good concrete example of the way in which blockchain technology is potentially going to disrupt and alter an industry. And TradeLens, for those who don't know, was the collaboration between Maersk Shipping and IBM, looking at creating a new standard for technology, rather like containerization created a physical standard within shipping over several decades. The idea was that TradeLens would do something similar from the technology perspective. And until November of last year, all was looking well. They were getting adoptions from various players within the industry, including some pretty major competitors. And yet in November of 2022, Maersk, very unexpectedly, not just to us, but also to industry experts, announced that they were discontinuing TradeLens and that the platform would cease to be running after the end of this year. And that was for various reasons. One, to do with the return on investment just wasn't coming quickly enough for the Maersk board, and there was concern that it may not ever actually make money. Two was a sense of politics with some of the key competitors who'd signed on showing a lack of will to really start to embed these technologies, or looking at other projects that might be used instead. And so we kind of are presented with the fact that we have a case box now in the 6th edition that will be there for forever of a case that's no longer really valid. So for the 7th edition, of course, we have changed that case box, and we've talked all about this challenge of technology adoption and diffusion, and the issue of politics in making innovation and change. But of course, you do get a box where you go, it's a shame that now people looking at one of our editions will say, well, that just ain't relevant anymore. In a similar way, of course, we have one of yours, Nigel, as well.
Yeah, we're all guilty of this. Again, about 3 or 4 years ago, I got this notification from a news service I subscribed to about Adidas and how they're opening speed factories, they call them, one in Germany and one in the States. And the idea was that for sneakers, for trainers, the vast majority, of course, I mean the vast majority, 90-something%, are made in well-established supply chains in the Far East, largely, originally in China, but increasingly in places like Vietnam, Laos, and so on. The problem with those supply networks out there, that although they're well developed and they are very, very efficient in terms of cost terms, they can be slow. Can be 18 months from making design changes, designing a new pair of shoes, to actually getting them to the market. And particularly for the more fashionable lines, for Adidas and Nike and people like that, they want to react faster than that. Hence the idea of this near market speed factory. The idea was that they divide the range in two. The majority of standard stuff would still be made in the Far East using efficient supply chains, whereas the highly fashionable, often limited edition sneakers would be made in these speed factories close to the market. I was very proud of this box because it plays into a well understood and known piece of supply chain theory about distinguishing Fisher's work, about distinguishing between different ways of competing and therefore reflecting those different ways of competing in the management and design of supply chains. So I thought this was great. Within less than 12 months, Adidas decided they were closing their Nearmark factories. Now, again, like Alistair, the only thing we could do is not change the story as such, but add to the existing story and draw lessons out of it. So rather than, hey, look, here's a company opening a new part of the supply network to better compete in certain, albeit small markets, to this is why they tried it and this is why it didn't work. The fact that it did work, well, it did work, but it just didn't work well enough. It couldn't get anywhere close to the cost advantage that Far East supply chains could meet. And those supply chains have been developed over decades. They're bedded in, they work well. The literally thousands of small companies operating in those supply chain networks have learnt over the decades. It's difficult to suddenly, from a clean sheet of paper, come up with something new. So sometimes we get things too early and we get things wrong. Why is this important to us? Let me give you an insight into the timescales that we're tending to work to when we're writing textbooks. If I start writing, or if Alistair starts writing at a particular point of time, we're usually delivering the manuscript to Pearson about 7-8 months, say, after we start writing. So there's a period of writing where we're getting ideas, we're doing the research, we're writing extra material, and so on. We deliver the manuscript and the picture and the diagrams and everything to Pearson, and it takes them about 10 months to go through the editorial, the production process, and publish that. So your free copies kind of start coming to you, coming to the people who might adopt the books around a year and a quarter after we've started writing. That fits nicely into the adoption cycle, but it means the earliest that something will be adopted into a new course is the semester about 6 months after publication. So the earliest it can be adopted is around kind of 1.7 years after we've started writing. And then there's a 3-year editorial cycle. At the moment, this could change with different books, but at the moment we write a new edition about every 3 years of the various books. So for 3 years, that is used as the current edition. However, within the market, there is also a second-hand market, and this has become increasingly important in textbook sales and resales over the years. In other words, students quite understandably sell their old books on to next generation of students. There's a second-hand market that starts coming in after a year for a new edition. So the average age of a book out there in the market that we have written that is being studied by students is somewhat over 4 years, between 4 and 5 years after we have written something. So the lag between us making a decision on what is and what isn't included in a book can be 4 or 5 years out of date and longer. You know, there are some books out there that have been second-hand and second-hand. You know, they've been out there circulating in the market a long time. This is why, as the world does get more turbulent, this issue about what to include, what not to include, gets increasingly important. And particularly what we've been thinking about recently, both from a teaching and a writing point of view, is do the examples we use all the time to illustrate operations issues cover a reasonable range of types of operation? And here's one way of thinking about it. This is us marking our own homework, really. One of the issues, already alluded to it, is this idea of the degree of service. What proportion of our examples are service versus manufacturing? Now, I know that's very much an artificial split in many ways, and the two things are merging. particularly if you subscribe to service dominant logic type of issues, then it is a bit of an artificial split. In our book, about 20% of all the examples we use, the named examples, are manufacturing. Now, you could argue that that is too many. And in pure GDP terms, you're probably right. However, manufacturing does have one great advantage for teaching, and that is you can explain a lot of concepts more readily using manufacturing than you can through the more nebulous and difficult to define type of services. Not saying they're less important or manufacturing more important or whatever, it's just for illustrative purposes, manufacturing can have advantages. We're about 20%. We're broadly happy with that. Unit of analysis is what we call, is it process level? Is it operations level? Is it supply network level? Most of the supply network stuff that we cover is, as you would expect, in the supply network chapters, which is kind of 2 and a bit chapters in effect, and we're broadly happy with that. Producer recipient, that is, do we look at B2C, B2B, B2 government, whatever, and so on. And about 50% are B2C and about 44% B2B of examples in our latest edition. This overemphasizes B2C. There are far more B2B relationships in this world than there are B2C relationships, but B2C are branded companies that students have heard of. And therefore, there is an attraction to using examples in that kind of setting. So again, although we're overemphasizing B2C, I'm broadly happy with that, or not unhappy with that. Profit versus non-profit dimension. We're really quite bad at this. If you count governmental organizations and local governmental organizations, social enterprises, charities, and so on, that's quite a large proportion of GDP, around 40% in many countries. Only about 7% of our examples are non-profit. We're failing on that. We've got to do something about it. But I hope you're seeing, as I'm talking through what we're doing in our books here, a structure that you can use to be critical about your own teaching. Think about what you do, and what do you want to do, what you should be doing here. Strategic focus, about 33% of all the examples we use have some kind of strategic coverage or strategic implications that can be drawn out. And again, I'm broadly happy with that. Volume variety, I think I may be being generous to ourselves here. About 20% of examples are low volume, high variety, as opposed to mass production or mass service type of examples. I've got a smiley face there. I think increasingly, as high volume operations become subsumed within the technology, whether it's information technology or manufacturing technology or whatever, then that's an underrepresentation of the more creative, low volume, customized, high variety operations.
And Nigel, it's worth saying something else about one of the strategies that both Nigel and I and colleagues here at both Warwick and at Bath take often when thinking about the content mix of an overall unit or an overall course is to simply look at who the students are in that room and roughly look at where they work. So if we've got 20% of people in that room who are from manufacturing, fine, have about 20% manufacturing content. If you've got a slightly higher preponderance of B2B workers, for example, in the more executive spaces, often that's the case, then we tend to up the amount of case content or examples we're giving in a B2B environment. If we're teaching to a group where there's a reasonably higher number of those who are working in a non-profit third sector environment, we tend to look to provide extra examples there. So that's a really simple diagnostic that you can use to sense check the balance of content for any given class, we would argue. That's something to consider as well.
Absolutely. And the lie to that, of course, is the degree of experience that those students in the room have. Again, one changes types of example with that. So kind of broadly, that's not a bad picture with one exception. However, there are other dimensions, of course. For example, what I call the revenue flow dimension. That is the flow of service different from the flow of revenue? This is mainly platform-based operations. For example, Facebook. Facebook provides service to you and I, or whoever the users of Facebook are. That's not where they make the money. They make the money by selling information about us to other companies. So there's almost a perpendicular flow of revenue that comes in a B2B basis from providing a B2C service. Less than 2% of examples that we have are platform-based. Things like Google and Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of them. We need to do something more about that. The problem is that there's just not a lot of information around about the internal operations of those businesses. There's some, and it will be included. The order penetration, that is, from one extreme, do we resource and create the service or the product to order, or do we provide it pre-prepared or from stock in some way? About 45% of our examples are create to order. Again, I'm reasonably happy with that, though I don't have any figures about the proportion of businesses that are make to order versus make to stock. The functional scope dimension, this is how many of the processes that we illustrate in our books are from within the operations function and how many outside, things like marketing, accounting processes, and so on. Less than 2%. In this book, that is the 10th edition of Operations Management, are non-operations, which is not good. We're slightly better in the Operations and Process Management book, which is going into its 7th edition soon. Because that's aimed at a slightly different market there, but still we could do more looking at non-operations processes.
And one of the things briefly to say here on this issue of kind of operations versus non-operations is part of our decision when we're writing, of course, is influenced by what we believe the subject is, but we also have to be somewhat cognizant of how you all and others who adopt our books actually teach. And so there is sometimes a tension where we might be inclined to push the bar slightly further across in some of these areas, yet we're also hearing that certain case boxes that are somewhat more operations or somewhat more manufacturing are more popular at times. And so we have a kind of balancing act there of not filling the book with too many cases that seem to stray away from the core subject. So there is a tension between our true interpretation of the subject and our interpretation needs, given the book is not just for us, it's for everyone in that regard.
True. Next dimension, steady state versus transient. Less than 5% of our examples deal with transient conditions, basically. And again, we're unhappy about that because the nature of real operations management, of course, is dealing with very slippery and uncertain environments. And particularly given the changes that are happening, we have to do more. That operations activities, that is how much is design, how much is direct, how much is delivery, how much is developed, about equal split, and we're broadly satisfied with that. So again, you may disagree with this, you will certainly have your own views on this. It's just a structure that we use to think about our content and how you might want to think about your content. So what is happening? What are the big things happening in the world? Well, so many. Here's just a few that I wrote down in about 30 seconds that are, you will have your own list, but things from political conflicts, geopolitical uncertainty, the increasing importance of hybrid working. There are many things I haven't got, like the rise of the gig economy, for example, I haven't included in there. So it's not a comprehensive list. But what is important, I think, is that when we're thinking about this, we need to distinguish between cause and effect. There are a whole load of things like climate change, political conflict, and so on, changing customer expectations that are basically the socio-geopolitical economic causes of the things that will affect us. Things like hybrid working, commodity prices, regulation, and so on there. So first point is we find it useful to distinguish fairly, as clearly as we can, not always easy, but when we can, between cause and effect. Sometimes that's helped, or it's helped to think about these changes by just taking a slightly abstract take on it. For example, let's have a look at the operations objectives. Quality, speed, dependability, flexibility, cost, sustainability, and think about how all these changes together may affect the relative importance of these. Of course, that will depend on what kind of operation you're talking about and what part of the world you're in, and different types of operation will have different views on this. But generally, what's it likely to be? I've run this with a couple of MBA groups recently, a combination of their views and my views. You just think which of these relative to each other, not in absolute terms, but relative to each other, are going to get more important, do we think, given the turbulence? This is roughly some kind of combination of them and me. Quality about the same, speed relatively, it's not going to get less important, but relative to the others, perhaps not as important as it was. Whereas dependability, yeah, we're wanting dependability, particularly in an age of uncertain supply chains. Flexibility or agility to cope with those changes, particularly important. Cost in an era of rising commodity prices, yeah, very important. Sustainability for all manner of both ethical and market reasons, and so on. Again, you may have a different view. Try this with your students. It's great for getting debate going. You have to shut them up after a bit because they will argue forever over this one, but it's a good introduction. It sensitizes students to dealing with a lot of these changes. Right, here is again another structural issue that is we've just put together. I have to say, it formalizes what we've been doing informally for quite a while now in trying to judge what to include and what not to include. Here are some of the criteria that we're using. First of all, how frequent is it likely to be? This, is it a one-off? For example, 13 years ago, that volcano in Iceland, it had a huge erupted, had a huge impact on supply all over the world. And certainly when I was teaching around that time, nearly every essay I got back for a year after that was full of how do we prepare for Icelandic volcanoes? Well, of course, it never happened again. It might do in the future, but it's unlikely. Whereas something like some technologies, of course, like AI, will go through a whole series of repeated improvements and changes there. So how frequent, how enduring are its effects likely to be? Is it transient, something that will come and go? Or is it likely to be more permanent? And this, Alistair and I had huge discussions about COVID when we were writing OPM6 on this one, very important issue. How many types of operation will it affect? Just a few. For example, process mining, will it just affect some internal processes or legal processes or all kinds of processes? Where do we place it on that? How many topics is it likely to affect? Is it just going to affect, for example, warehouse technology? It's just going to affect kind of warehouse management, maybe, or all of them. ChatGPT probably affect almost everything. And how much consensus is there on the consequences of change? You look at the decent newspapers, Financial Times, Economist, and so on, and see what they say about it. Don't look at academic journals because they're out of date by the time you read anything about them. So something, for example, like artificial intelligence, where would we place that? Again, you will have your view on that. This is roughly where I put it. Key issue there being this bottom here, very little consensus. The press are full of articles on artificial intelligence and large language models and ChatGPT and all the rest of them. It will have an effect, I'm pretty sure, but what that effect will be, not at all sure. COVID, well, where's COVID, to the left or to the right? Probably mainly to the left. But now certainly there's more consensus about the effect it has had, although if you read the Financial Times this morning or this afternoon, the headline was China comes out of COVID-related recession far faster than anyone thought it would do. Internet of Things, where would you put Internet of Things? Well, I'd put it there personally. And I'm going quite quickly because I'm realizing we're starting to run into question time here, and I want to allow time for questions. But here is a structure that we use, and I say this formalizes what we've been doing. Set of criteria, you can change it yourself. By the way, talking about change and models like this one, a question, someone submitted, thank you for this question, which was, where did the 4Vs model come from? Okay, the honest answer is inside my head. That's where it came from. I didn't get divine revelation. I didn't do a 5-year research project. I made it up. And that's what Alistair and I do all the time. We make models up. They work. If they don't work, we don't use them. We road test them in teaching situations. But essentially, they are illustrative models that work to try and communicate an idea. Don't think they can't be changed. Don't think you can't do your own. Right. Very, very quickly go through this. For example, as things do become less predictable, should we be moving towards teaching principles rather than specifics? For example, process technology, and this is just how I do it. If you look back at the first edition of these books that we write, the chapter on process technology was about, here is process technology, it's called robotics, let me tell you something about it. Or here is information technology, and let me tell you something about that. We've changed because there's so many technologies now. So the first thing to do maybe is try and identify what a new technology does. This is the model we use in the book. We say, look, there are 5 basic things that new technology does. It thinks, it sees, it communicates, it moves stuff, and it changes stuff. Try and look at any new technology and place it somewhere within that space, within that 5-dimensional space. So rather than thinking about specific technologies, we've moved towards try and place it in the context of what other technologies do. Secondly, when should we be making technology decisions? Here's just an example, a personal example. Last year, I had to upgrade the machine I'm using now, my desktop, my iMac desktop, and I had a decision to make. Should I change then, or should I wait until the new chip, the Apple design chip, was incorporated in it? As it happened, I couldn't wait. I wanted it now. So I bought it now. That's a thing that has become known as the bionic duckweed problem. And this phrase comes from a parliamentary commission in the UK, where a number of civil servants and MPs were listening to evidence on the electrification of the UK railway system. And you got one expert, he was an academic, of course, who said we shouldn't be electrifying our railways at all. That's old technology. Within a few years, all trains will be running on hydrogen generated by processing duckweed, which was a kind of organic matter that's grown in ponds somewhere. Of course, it's nonsense. But what it's become to mean is delaying a technology investment decision because you think something better is going to come along tomorrow. That's a generic problem, and you can find lots of examples of it. Perhaps that's what we should be teaching. That's the kind of issue we should be teaching. The other thing maybe is, as we evaluate technologies, let's evaluate them against operations criteria of some things. How will it affect performance? And here are just a number of examples, and all these slides will be made available to you after the webinar. Right, how do we incorporate these things into the curriculum? Basically, we've got 2 ways of doing that. You can take an issue, and either you can put it throughout the lessons, or in our case, the chapters, or you can have a separate session or chapter devoted specifically to that issue. This is something that we originally did with corporate social responsibility, about more than 10 years ago now, where we had a specific chapter devoted to it, chapter 21. You remember the criticism we got, Alistair, for doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I think it was the 5th edition of the book where the chapter 21 CSR was introduced, and that was partly in response to colleagues saying, you know, this is an issue that we need to talk to, and also a kind of a personal reflection from you and I believe Bob at the time, kind of working on that. But then when we were in the Amsterdam, one of our workshops, we have, you know, workshops most years, and we were in Amsterdam doing one, and one of the guys there was kind of quite severe with us, and he was kind of saying, well, yeah, this is all very good, but, you know, how do I teach it? How do I actually bring it into I don't have a separate class on it. I want to be able to teach this alongside the subjects. So if I'm teaching capacity management, what does sustainability mean to capacity management? If I'm teaching inventory, if I'm teaching process, etc., etc. And in a way, although he was somewhat rude in his style from my memory, Nigel, we kind of came back from that thinking, yeah, he's kind of got a point, actually. And on reflection, we then started to we got rid of chapter 21. I think in the 7th edition, chapter 21 came out, and we instead had corporate social responsibility or sustainability content sitting within each chapter as a response to that. However, then we also got a whole load of negative reactions because, well, we had lots of positive ones, but we also had some negative ones because people going, oh my goodness, you've got rid of chapter 21. You've stopped caring about sustainability. This is outrageous. What does this say about you as a group of authors that you don't care? And by the way, this young guy, Alistair, who's on your author team, it must have been him. You know, is he working for big oil? You're thinking, no, it really is there. In fact, it's there more. So more recently, of course, with the introduction of the responsible operations boxes in the 10th edition, and of course in the 6th edition of ops and process management and 3rd edition of essentials, it's partly to really front and center highlight that the content's there and it matters, and we can then speak to how you teach this in different subjects. So it's a kind of an interesting journey, I guess, of how we approach a particular subject area. We have had a similar conversations around technology, like should we have a technology chapter was a conversation in the last edition, or should we essentially do something similar and put it across, and in effect what we've done is a bit of both. You'll see in these latest editions of the books there's a lot more technology examples in every single chapter, but we still have, in particularly the large book, a separate process technology chapter as well. So we've kind of done a bit of both.
Yeah. So that's it, really. Sorry, we slightly rushed through this last bit and we're still behind. There is now some time for questions, but if you have more questions, there are our email addresses. Please don't hesitate to contact us directly with questions. Happy to get back. So Daniel, now, do we have any general questions we can address?
Yes, we do. So firstly, thanks for that. It's really interesting. I'm gonna there's one in the chat, but I'm gonna start with a pre-submitted question just because just so you have a bit of time to read that other one. But naturally, the chat GPT is the big discussion point at the moment within most academia that I've seen. Before I get to the actual question, I would invite anyone to watch Pearson's recent webinar on chat GPT, with another one coming up soon. But you've just mentioned that it's really hard to predict what will happen with chat GPT. I guess, do you have any ideas on how OM teachers specifically could integrate chat GPT into their teaching?
Well,
and should they?
Into the learning, certainly. I don't know about the teaching, but yeah, the most of the questions I've got in the last few weeks on ChatGPT is how it will affect assessment. My own view is quite harsh on this, which is it should affect assessment beneficially. In other words, stop setting assignments that can be answered totally by ChatGPT. Move more towards mini case studies where you really have to analyze and weigh evidence up in a way that ChatGPT might find quite difficult, rather than just setting a generic essay topic. I'm not saying that's necessarily easy, but it's certainly the way forward, I think. So in that sense, you could argue that ChatGPT will actually force us down a better assessment path.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to just build on that. So, for example, some of the way we currently run assessments for operations here at Bath are through various simulations, be they the online, some of the Pearson online ones, various other ones, or be they physical simulations that people then reflect on. So like the operations, a card making game that then you are expected to write some reflections on. Now that is something that ChatGPT really struggles with, and we know that because we've had a colleague actually try and create an assignment and see what they could generate, and it's pretty weak because they have to, the students are writing about the reflections of how they worked as a group, they're writing reflections on actually how they performed in the game with the specific information of that game. So it struggles quite a lot there once you start doing, I guess, more hands-on forms of assessment. Another route that we're increasingly seeing colleagues adopt prior to this anyway, but just generally, is running various kind of physical presentations, or indeed in even individual mini vivas where you literally just bring in students and quiz them on a few key issues or a mini case that they have to just deal with in the moment. That's again something that's very hard to use ChatGPT for.
It'll make assessment more difficult or more intensive, more kind of time consuming to assess, I think. Specific, everyone's marked hundreds of essays on the same topic, and you can scan through them and you can give a mark fairly accurately by just in your head ticking off the kind of things they talk about there. You can't do that with a lot of ChatGPT proof assessments.
Daniel, there's a question in the chat. I've been, as you have seen, folks, I've been sort of dealing with various questions have been going along, and also posting various reflections on what Nigel was saying and what our thoughts are on the subject. But Arturus was asking particularly about the action response case, which is one of those kind of classic and incredibly popular cases, which in each edition, Nigel and I sort of asked the question of, okay, is it now the time to change it? Because although it's incredibly popular, it works very well as a teaching case. Is it starting to get a bit dated? Because it describes a paper-based process. And I think the simple answer is we still see lots of paper-based processes, particularly in this setting, because I work in the third sector. I'm actually working on automation of applications processes, and as part of that, we see huge numbers of charities that look very much like action response. But I think there are sort of small tweaks that we are looking to make to just bring it up to date in terms of some of the language around things like faxes that aren't relevant so much anymore. But there is a kind of broader question that Arturus, your question raises, which is, when do we get rid of case studies? So for example, in the last edition, we replaced another very, very popular case study of Blackberry Hill Farm, the capacity management case, with Fresh Lunch. And it wasn't because Blackberry Hill Farm wasn't a good case and wasn't popular. It was simply because we felt that it's good to bring in new examples to kind of freshen it up. So there is always a tension here between change for change's sake and to generate a sense of each edition is really fundamentally different. And we would never want to be accused, like some author groups are, of where every edition just looks the same. Ours that isn't the case. But not just throwing things out because it happens to be old. And I think we hopefully tread that line carefully. But what I would say, and again, this is a request to all of you, is if there are ever cases that increasingly feel like they don't work for whatever reason, tell us. Tell us if it's that they need like an IKEA approach, which is just to bring them and change their narrative, or whether they just need kicking out and replacing. And it's not that we will always do what we're told, but it's always good to know where content is starting to feel in some ways dated, because we look to be up to date, but at the same time we cannot be up to date perfectly across every single subject area simultaneously, and so we look to the community to advise us a lot on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. We'll have to cut off there because we've run slightly over, but that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for joining and participating. Also, special thanks to Babby and Dan from Pearson for all your hard work in the background. And of course, big thanks to Nigel and Alistair for joining and sharing your knowledge. It's very much appreciated. We'll be in touch afterwards with all of you in the form of 2 emails, one giving you information on how you can get in touch with someone from Pearson for a sample copy, demonstration or consultation. And there'll be a second one a bit later with a link to the recording of today's webinar. And also do feel free to get in touch with Nigel and Alistair. They've provided their email address. I'm sure they wouldn't mind a LinkedIn ad either. So yeah,
100%.
yeah, that's it from us today. So thanks again, and we'll leave it there. Bye for now.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks
Thank you,
everyone for
Daniel.
attending. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. All the best, and it's great seeing so many people.